and talk more about Nigel Farage, because NatWest is now facing an investigation into whether it actually broke the law as the fallout from the Nigel Farage banking scandal wipes an extraordinary £850 million off the company's value. As we know, Dame Alison Rose finally quit as chief executive. This was about 1:30 in the morning on Wednesday. Obviously, there was this U-turn where the bank said they had full confidence in her, which I then said meant that she was on her way out, and then, quite frankly, she disappeared off. Now, Nigel Farage has also complained to the Information Commissioner's Office. Now, that means if they find there is a breach here of data protection, they can find 4% of the company's turnover, which could be hundreds of millions of pounds. And the big question is what happens from here. Should Howard Davies go, the NatWest chair, Peter Flavel as well, the CEO of Coutts, or Nigel Farage is saying the whole board needs to go as well. Joining us now is Ross Clark, columnist at The Sun. Good morning to you.
Good morning, hi.
So this is the story that just won't go away. NatWest, I mean, talk about a case study and how not to deal with the problem.
Well, exactly. And I mean, don't forget, I mean, NatWest is RBS as it was. The bank that nearly went bust in 2008 was bailed out with £27 billion. £27 billion it's cost taxpayers so far, that bailout. And, you know, what have we got for our money? This bank, which is sort of, you know, caught up in various scandals, you know, debanking people for their political views and, you know, possibly breaking data protection rules as well. You know, as far as I'm concerned, it would have been better if RBS had been allowed to go bust back in 2008. Its operations being taken over by receivers and broken up. And the trouble is, you know, by bailing it out, we've given it this sort of idea that it's too big to fail and that it can sort of get away with anything. But I mean, it's very serious business. This is a bank that's 40% owned by the government, 40% owned by taxpayers, and you know, it ought to be a sort of setting an example of how to banks should behave.
Well, absolutely. You make a really important point there, and the Labour Party is saying, well, actually, maybe the government was too heavy-handed. Surely the point is we own 40% of it, 39%, i.e. the government is involved. Therefore, if the government is unhappy with the corporate governance of that bank, the government should say so.
Well, exactly. I mean, you know, the government is the largest shareholder, and the idea that it's nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with the taxpayer, it is absurd. I mean, that is the reality. If you have a sort of semi-nationalised business like NatWest, well, it becomes very, very much part of the government's business, how it's run.
Well, Nigel Farage actually goes on to say the bank's quest to promote diversity and inclusion has turned it into a divisive and poisonous cult. Now, obviously, NatWest is about to reveal its results as well. This is not going to play well.
No, it's not. Well, I mean, this whole business goes back to a decision 2 years ago. Coutts proudly declared it had become something called a B Corp. And now B Corp sort of classification, it's like the sort of Stonewall diversity scheme, if you like. You sort of have to prove that you're running your company in accordance with certain values that is, which are set by this sort of B Corp organisation, which is sort of born out of sort of American business schools. And what it means is that to become a B Corp, you have to sort of say, well, shareholders are no longer fully in charge of this company. We're running it for all stakeholders, not just shareholders, but the public, the staff and society, the climate, and you know, it's all this sort of fuzzy stuff which has taken NatWest of eye off the ball of what they're supposed to be doing, and that's really from that which the decision to debank Nigel Farage springs, because, you know, he was deemed not to share the bank's values. But of course, when we talk about NatWest corporate values, we really mean the values of its senior staff, because you can't tell me that among NatWest's 160,000 staff, there are not a very large number of people who agree with Nigel Farage, who voted Brexit and who are more likely to share his politics than those of some B Corp corporation out in America.
I'm glad you brought up the B word here, because there is a great editorial being written in the Telegraph saying that actually, is this all about NatWest's judgment on Brexit itself? The fact is they compiled a dossier on Nigel Farage because, quite frankly, they didn't like what he stood for. They actually had myriad of references to his Brexit campaigning. This littered the Coutts dossier. They described him as xenophobic and a disingenuous grifter who panders to races. I'd like to remind them that actually 52% of people voted for Brexit.
Well, exactly. And I mean, who in their right mind now would want to open a bank account with Coutts, knowing that, you know, their reputational risk committee could be compiling a report on them, you know, going through everything they've ever said or written in public and making a judgment on them like this. I mean, the damage that this has caused to Coutts and to NatWest Group more widely, I mean, is just immense. And, you know, the company seems to be extremely slow in coming round to understanding this. And I mean, on top of the reputational risk stuff, we now know that the chief executive of NatWest was actually discussing, you know, how much money one of its customers or ex-customers had with a BBC reporter. And I mean, what an extraordinary thing. I mean, you go to a bank, you put your money in a bank, you don't expect the sort of bank staff to start chattering to the world in general how much money you're depositing there. I mean, the discretion is all part of good banking, and it's been completely blown out of the water.
And I would agree with you. The central tenet of any banking system has to be trust, which has been totally eroded by what is going on. Just in terms of that, I just wonder what your comment is on the woke culture. You know, Coutts has spent a lot of money putting a rainbow in their window, being inclusive and diverse. And diverse. And what I would say is that surely what they should be doing is concentrating on banking. It reminds me of this story of Richard Fothergill, this vicar, who got the letter from the bank saying, what do you think of what we're doing? He wrote back to them and said, look, I'm very concerned about you supporting Pride. I'm also very nervous about the LGBT, or the T in LGBT. And basically he got a letter back saying, we don't like your thoughts and your views and your opinions, and you're cancelled.
Well, exactly. I mean, these banks are sort of behaving like student unions, sort of, you know, cancelling speakers because something they've said doesn't sort of conform to, you know, the latest fashionable view on some form of left-wing politics. But, you know, the difference is that the banks have vastly more power than a student union. I mean, if you have your bank closed, you have your bank account closed because you know you don't conform to some corporate value, but it can be very difficult then to open up a bank account with another bank, and you know you're effectively sort of debanking people, cutting them out of the financial system. Well, I mean, that's a sort of extremely horrible sort of way for anyone to proceed, and you know you wonder how on earth has a corporate culture got into this hole where it's sort of behaving like a you know, overgrown student union.
Indeed, day 4, and it shows no sign of abating. Let me just ask you about this other article in the Times. Thousands more violent offenders will be created by ministers' failure to get children back to school after the pandemic. This is about the generation of ghost children. We've talked extensively about this. Up to 9,000 more young offenders, including 2,000 violent criminals, could be on Britain's streets by 2027. This is simply because basically the government closed the schools. These kids disappeared. They went off into the black economy, into the black market. They are still missing. No one knows where they are, and they will turn to crime. It's unacceptable.
It is an absolutely shocking statistic. 1.7 million children missing more than 10% of their lessons. 125,000 children just virtually disappeared, you know, missing all their lessons. And this is a fallout from lockdown, the decision to close schools for weeks on end. That's where it started. And, you know, we're going to have these sort of fallouts from lockdown, you know, for going on for years. And, you know, the government's pandemic plan going into COVID, it was not to close the schools. You know, we had this considered policy that looked at all this sort of thing and concluded that, you know, if you had a pandemic, you couldn't stop the disease eventually getting through to the population. You keep the schools open because the collateral damage of closing them was far worse. And then come COVID, you know, government and its advisors panicked, basically, and they introduced a lockdown without any cost-benefit analysis, any consideration of the wider effects of lockdown. And, you know, we're now suffering those longer term.
And yet again, it seems there's no redress. No one takes responsibility for ruining the lives of a generation of young people. And it's unacceptable.
Well, I mean, the most disgusting thing about this, in a way, is that the way the government tried to sort of smother the effect of lockdowns on education by basically giving all kids a sort of free grade, you know, upgrading their performance. You know, basically, we had a generation of school children who missed out on education. They are, you know, they are not as well educated as, you know, their peers a couple of years earlier. But, you know, on paper, they look as if they got higher attainment because, you know, the teachers were allowed just to guess what grade they might have got in the exam. And we had this massive grade inflation. So, you know, for a couple of years, we had kids walking away from school with sort of incredibly impressive exam results, apparently. But, of course, in reality, they've been deprived of their education.
Ross, very good to talk to you. Thank you for your time. That's Ross Clark there.